But what of Canadian nuclear legacies? Where do we trace, or where do we look for the atom bomb here? This is a photograph taken in 1986 by Canadian atomic photographer Robert Del Tredici. There's an interesting website called the Atomic Photographers Guild that you should check out. It has a lot of documentation of atomic history on it. So what's shown here is the author Richard Rose holding a glass sphere, and this is the size of the plutonium core inside Fat Man, which was the bomb detonated over Nagasaki. And here's the striking part, that the entire, in the bomb, only about a teaspoon of plutonium was actually converted into explosive energy, just 1 teaspoon. So plutonium does not exist naturally. It's not something that you can just harvest from nature. It has to be manufactured in a reactor. I'm not sure if you're aware that Canada played a critical role in the manufacture of plutonium during the Cold War. We supplied uranium from the El Dorado mine in the Northwest Territories, and we produced plutonium at Chalk River, Ontario, starting in 1944. Between 1955 and 1985, for 30 years, this Chalk River facility sent more than 250 kilograms of plutonium to the U.S. Department of Energy for nuclear weapons production. This is an archival image of the Chalk River Laboratory in 1954. It's just 200 kilometers north of Ottawa. So beyond the science, though, think about the communities around this site. Thousands of workers built it and maintained it. Families lived nearby. What conversations were happening around the dinner tables about the risks of nuclear technology? And what about the 1952 partial meltdown, which spilled thousands of liters of radioactive waste into the Ottawa Valley? Today, that 37 square kilometer site along the Ottawa River holds 70% of all the radioactive waste ever produced by Atomic Energy of Canada. So Chalk River is just one piece of this larger radioactive inheritance that Canadians are still grappling with. Much of this waste is stored on or near Indigenous territories, raising profound questions about justice, responsibility, and long-term stewardship. So if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend a book by my colleague, Dr. Leanne Letty, which is called Serpent River Resurgence, which examines the legacy of uranium mining in Elliott Lake and its impact on Indigenous communities. But here's the thing, these legacies aren't just buried in reactors and waste sites, they're cultural. They shape how communities respond to crises, whether that's nuclear risk, pandemics, climate change. They show us how societies build infrastructures of safety, how they communicate risk, and how citizens learn to navigate life in the shadow of existential threats. So as a media scholar, this is what fascinates me: the visual and cultural communication of danger, safety, and belonging. How do images, infrastructures, and these networks of information shape our understanding of what it means to be a citizen in the age of threat? And what do these Cold War histories teach us about the challenges we face today? So here's another powerful image. I don't know if you've seen this before. It's not a photograph, but it's a photograph of a clock and a bunch of people. It's the Doomsday Clock. Created in 1947 by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, of which Einstein was an originator. It's one of the most striking graphic symbols of the nuclear age. Instead of hours and minutes, it marks humanity's proximity to self-destruction. The closer the hands move towards midnight, the closer we are to catastrophe. And the clock here is still ticking. On January 28th of this year, so the board gets together every year and changes the clock. Last year it was at 90 seconds. This year it's at 89 seconds, which is the closest it's ever been. Daniel Holtz, the current chair of the board, put it this way, quote, "The purpose of the Doomsday Clock is to start a global conversation about the very real existential threats that keep the world's top scientists awake at night." National leaders must commence discussions about these global risks before it's too late. Reflecting on these life and death issues and starting a dialogue are the first steps to turning back the clock and moving away from midnight. So, the words of these scientists should jolt us awake. We know what needs to be done. The problem is we're missing the will. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why, right? How did Canadians respond to these kind of existential threats in the Cold War? And how do communities here in Southern Ontario in particular grapple with the possibility of nuclear warfare and planetary destruction? The story isn't just about superpowers, right? It played out right in our own backyards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the propaganda materials that were generated during that time. We know there were conflicts that erupted around the world, like I mentioned the Korean War, the Vietnam War, you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. But looming behind them was this ultimate fear, right? That these clashes could escalate into nuclear war. But here's something more crucial. It wasn't just about firepower, as we've already mentioned. It was fought with ideas. Propaganda became one of those powerful weapons. Governments weren't just concerned with enemies abroad. They were also focused on identifying enemies within. Dissenters at home, socialists, feminists, communists, revolutionaries, and so-called leftist agitators were portrayed as dangerous and even traitorous. Does the language sound familiar? Right, we hear it today. Popular media carried this message forward, and this is before the advent of the internet or anything like that. So the echo chambers are a lot more intense these days. It was films, it was comic books, it was posters in the 1950s and 60s that became vehicles for anti-communist propaganda. Hollywood gave us pulp titles like I Married a Communist and The Iron Curtain. These were both from 1949, where communists were portrayed as shadowy villains lurking in plain sight. One common trope was the femme fatale, the seductive woman whose allure masked sinister communist intentions. And I don't know if you can read the tagline from the poster there on the left, but it says, trained in the art as old as time, she served a mob of terror and violence, yielding kisses that invite disaster, destroy, then kill. But these films weren't just stories, right? They were cultural weapons, teaching audiences who to trust and who to fear. Even Canadian stories were pulled into this. This American thriller, The Iron Curtain, dramatized the defection of Igor Guzenko and was loosely based on his memoirs. The film ends reassuring its audience that Guzenko and his family are safe under RCMP protection, their security guarantee, because he gave his life for the survival of the democratic way of life. So these stories are, what they reveal isn't just a kind of paranoia, right? They show how Cold War propaganda shaped ideas of citizenship, who belonged and who didn't, and who got to define this democratic way of life. And at the heart of this were always deeper issues of gender, sexuality, race, class, and above all, nation. So we can see the Cold War was this geopolitical struggle, but as a cultural battle, also it was fought in people's living rooms, schools, and workplaces, similar to the kinds of issues that we're facing now. So this is the headline here is from a National Post story. The matronly alleged Soviet spy at the center of Canada's only national sex scandal. So I'll just, as a thought experiment, when do you think that headline was published? How long ago? National Post. Take it. 2021. Mm-hmm. So we're still recycling. We're still recycling these same old tropes, right? It's kind of like something straight out of a Cold War thriller. But so the article revisited the story of Gerda Munsinger, an alleged Soviet spy living in Germany who, back in the 1950s, had emigrated to Canada. She became entangled with Pierre Savigny, who was Associate Defense Minister under Prime Minister Diefenbaker and was rumored to be in an illicit affair. Okay? So on the surface, it was a scandal about sex and politics, but beneath the headlines, it was something else entirely. A lesson in how gender and nation became a communicative tool for Cold War politics. Was Munsinger a spy, or as one journalist crudely asked, was she too matronly, to be a threat? So let's look at these contrasting portrayals. On the left, this is an article from Weekend magazine in 1966. It was kind of like a weekly periodical, I guess. It was published in Montreal. Describes her as a, quote, shapely blonde sensation, and immediately raises the specter of her being a security risk. On the right is an image from a 2018 article in Legion magazine, which, if you're history buffs, you know, right? Legion magazine bills itself as Canada's military history periodical. But it revises this scandal with the same tired dichotomy, spy or party girl. Actually, that's the headline in the Legion magazine. So, I don't know. I kind of take umbrage with this recirculation of these tropes in the ways in which we talk about the historical record. Right? I think they demand a little bit more critical attention from us. In that piece, Munsinger is quoted as saying, quote, if a woman wants to make a career for herself, she must learn to listen. When men want to talk, I let them talk, end quote. So this is taken up by the journalist as being evidence of good skills for a mistress or a spy. So what fascinates me about this story that's circulated quite a bit in different historical contexts, including museums in Canada, is not whether she was a spy or she wasn't, right? It's how her body, her nationality, and the way she performed gender were made into symbols, emblems of who belonged and who didn't in the Canadian Democratic Project. This type of thinking extended deep into the fabric of Canadian society in the Cold War. Consider the RCMP's so-called fruit machine. I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, right? It was a scientific experiment by, I'm not going to capture it accurately, but it was researchers at a university in, I believe it was in Ottawa, psychologists who developed this technique where they surveilled and interrogated suspected LGBTQ plus people who worked for the civil service and the Canadian Armed Forces. So you can see a documentary on this, actually, that was produced about 6 years ago now called The Fruit Machine. And the Canadian government actually recently made an official apology to many of these people who lost their employment. Because they were perceived as, because homosexuality was illegal at the time, they were perceived as a security risk because they could be blackmailed. Right? So many of them lost their jobs. So these stories of Munsinger of the Fruit Machine show us how Cold War Canada defined good citizenship by drawing boundaries around gender, sexuality, race, belonging, and nation. But they don't just sit in the past, these legacies. They echo today, right? In the ways in which we imagine which bodies belong and which don't in the current nation of Canada. When we think about gendered Islamophobia and other people who are marked as suspicious, dangerous, or somehow not deserving of a place in the construction of the so-called democratic way of life. So I think this is one of the Cold War's enduring lessons. Nation building was and still is built on drawing lines between us and them. Ideological conflict wasn't only about nuclear warheads or Soviet spies. It was about managing perceived risks of otherness right here at home. I don't know how long I've been talking. Half an hour. Okay, we've got a bit more time. So I want to dive a little bit into these two case studies. Let's talk about the propaganda posters. So some of you are probably familiar with this duck and cover campaigns of the 1950s where they were drills in schools where children were taught to hide under the desks as if that could save them from a nuclear blast. Okay, so most people realized that building bunkers in their backyard And one of my colleagues, Andrew Birch, who's the Cold War historian at the War Museum, wrote a great book about Canada's attempts to encourage people to build bunkers in their backyards. Canadians weren't convinced by this. They didn't want to go along with this activity. They were fairly suspicious of this as an actual technique to protect themselves from the risks of nuclear warfare. But nevertheless, Canada had a branch of civil defense education. And it was, today we would call it emergency preparedness or public safety. But back then it was called civil defense education. The threats may have changed. Today we've got pandemics, cyber warfare, but the strategies for teaching citizens how to respond are eerily familiar. So this poster titled "Will It Happen Here" features Canada's Cold War mascots, and I want to talk about a little bit about how these characters were developed. Be alert and just in case. Obviously, their names are a ridiculous play on the warning to be alert just in case of a nuclear attack. And in most of these posters, as you'll see, these are the two. This is be alert and just in case back here. They're always rushing to the aid of civilians in the aftermath of some kind of bombing. The bright colors grab your eye, and the cartoon figures add a strange sort of friendliness to the scene, and the message is clear that Canadians have a responsibility to be ready to participate and defend. So I uncovered some of these posters at National Archives, and my research assistants and I looked deeply into the advertising campaign that was behind this to try and figure out why they came up with this and how they thought that this kind of campaign was going to convince Canadians. And they printed thousands of these posters in different official languages and sent them all over the provinces, right across the nation. And they were put up in hospitals and schools and all kinds of other public locations. It was one of 14 that were created as part of this advertising campaign. If you've ever seen Mad Men, you know that in the 1950s, advertising was booming. And governments figured out that hiring advertising executives was a great way to sell war. So the Canadians did the same. They hired this guy from Montreal, Sidney Denman, who came up with this campaign and was behind authoring these. It wasn't without its controversy. A lot of people thought that these cartoon figures were pretty ridiculous. Canadians weren't going to listen to this message, and it was maybe a little too frivolous, right? In the face of nuclear war, why were we using this cartoon campaign? So what I wanted to say here, I'm trying my notes. Okay. One of the messages that was really important in these posters was about cooperation. So this poster, just in case, says, disasters occur in peacetime too. Don't wait for war. Support your civil defense team now. Disaster may never occur, but let's be ready. So the idea was that your life might depend on your civil defense team. The emphasis was on local, community-based actions, since national and provincial agencies couldn't tailor plans to every region. Finally, there was this idea of preparedness. The text often spoke directly to viewers. You can't avert disaster. Your life may depend, making nuclear readiness feel like a matter of personal responsibility, right? Even citizenship. So the one on the left, keep calm and carry on, you've seen it on everything. Mugs, pencils. It's reproduced all the time. It's actually from the Blitz. It's a British civil defense propaganda campaign that has been reproduced, repurposed, and very familiar to people. But who counted as a good citizen here, right? And what roles were people expected to play? So the campaign featuring Be Alert and Just in Case gives a window into these, how civil defense shaped these questions. The cheerful cartoon characters weren't just teaching people how to prepare for emergencies, they were also teaching us about our obligations and our responsibility. Let's do a little deeper dive into the posters. Let's start with B. She's always dressed neatly. So B is the one down here in the little white cap. A skirt suit, modest heels, coiffed hair, and minimal makeup. And you can see that in this other one in the background as well. As Ryan points out in her analysis of poster girls in US recruitment propaganda, visual cues such as dress, facial expression, hairstyle, conveyed a standardized and idealized feminine beauty that embodied normative archetypes. So Be Alert and Just in Case had these two foils, which are nameless, and they're these, I'm going to just say they're the disheveled blonde-haired woman and the disheveled red-haired man. And they're always juxtaposed as doing like the stupid thing, where Be Alert and Just in Case are doing, the responsible thing. So when we look at the blonde-haired woman, we see her attire as kind of casual and careless. In this poster, she's, where is it? Oh, okay, in this poster, she's picking flowers while the bull behind her lurks nearby. In another, the one that we looked at earlier, she's drawn with dark under-eye circles and crooked teeth, a visual shorthand that raises questions about feminine respectability. The message is clear, right? One is a model citizen and the other isn't. And we see the same kind of contrast at play between Just in Case and the red-haired man. Justin is calm, rational, and prepared. He faces danger with quiet confidence, a steady veteran ready to protect his community. His companion, by contrast, is emotional, clumsy, and often ridiculous, here with like a pillow strapped to his butt because he can't even ride a horse. So the lessons with these poster series are very, very pointed. One person embodies bravery and reason, and the other incompetence and failure. So it's worth remembering that these images circulated at a time when war veterans were celebrated as the ultimate model citizens. Just in Case may have even been drawn to evoke an ideal kind of older, potentially wiser veteran himself. He always looks like he's sort of the red-haired man's grandfather in this series. So you can see that it was also about producing and policing identities, right? Teaching who counted as good citizens. Any thoughts about that? Can you see how that visual messaging is really conveyed in these poster series? So let's turn to something a little more literally concrete. Spend a few minutes now at the end talking about bunkers in Canada. During the late 1950s, federal officials were urging the Canadian government to prepare for nuclear war. I talked about the scheme for backyard fallout shelters that didn't go very far, but there was a more successful scheme for building emergency shelters for the government. And they were meant for the government to have continuity in case of a nuclear blast. So the government would go somewhere, they would live inside these bunkers for a period of time. A vast network of communications was established, and that was how Ottawa was going to communicate with all of the provinces and tell people in communities what it was they were supposed to do. So Diefenbaker built 11 of these nuclear fallout shelters across the country, and they were nicknamed Diefenbakers. So some of you have been to this museum. If you haven't been here, I highly suggest you go. It has a very weird history. Up until 1996, it was still used by the Canadian military as a communications facility. And then it was sold to the city of Carp for $1. And they were kind of trying to figure out what they should do with it. People wanted to flood it, turn it into a place for diving, paintball, all kinds of things. They decided to turn it into a museum. And it's a Cold War museum. So they also built these nuclear bunkers in different locations across the provinces. In the province of Ontario, there were only 2 built. And in the region of Waterloo, back then it was Waterloo County, they were the only region to spend money to actually embed a concrete structure into the ground. So part of our research is trying to figure out, why would they do that? You know, why would the city of Waterloo or the region of Waterloo want to build this structure where no other provinces sort of got involved to this extent? There is another, what we call MAGHU, Municipal Emergency Government Headquarters building, right? But it's in Aurora and it was built in an existing structure. This is the only purpose-built one. So it's quite fascinating. This site, known as the Freeport Bunker, and these are some of the plans, it's almost a 6,000 square foot structure on the banks of the Grand River in the south end of Kitchener. You can go and walk by it now. If you know Kitchener and you know where you can rent canoes to go down the Grand, near the Freeport Hospital, that's where it is. You can park in the little parking lot and go out and walk around and look at it. It used to be used by the University of Waterloo. I believe it was the University of Waterloo, or maybe it was a community rowing club. But of course, the whole building had to be remediated because it was full of asbestos. So it was a big controversy in the region of Waterloo what to do with this structure in the last 4 or 5 years. Should it be knocked down? Should they remediate it? Should it be used for public education? Should it have other purposes? So the city council did decide to spend a couple of $100,000 remediating it. In other words, making it safe so the asbestos isn't going to fly all over the place. And that's what it looks like now. There's a fence around it. The 10-inch thick concrete walls reduced radiation exposure inside to just 1/500th of what it would be outside. The building could support 40 people for several weeks. These are a couple pictures that I took. I was lucky enough to get a tour, but it's complicated to get inside because of all the safety concerns. So right now the structure is closed. The region of Waterloo was interested in moving forward with a community project, but that's been a little bit shelved and it's been quite controversial. I wanted to talk a little bit about that, maybe at the end. The local archives give us some clues as to why the region of Waterloo was so interested in this project. This is a story from 1955 in the Kitchener-Waterloo record about the county's emergency measures organization. And you'll notice they're putting out a call for 4,600 civil defense workers, which at the time was about 7% of the entire population. So there really was this expectation that people would do this work. This is an interesting story about a special unit that was created in Wilmot County, and it was connected to a lot of Mennonite organizing. The Wilmot Women's, this is a tongue twister. You read it, if I try and say it, I'm going to screw it up. Wilmot Women's Welfare Service. Say that 3 times fast. And they attended one of the civil defense courses out in Arnprior in Ottawa, the Civil Defense College, which was doesn't exist anymore, and all of those archives kind of disappeared, unfortunately. Some of them made their way into national archives and other museum archives. But I think what's interesting here is that, these local women kind of go against those stereotypes that we've seen in the propaganda, showing that women in the Waterloo region took leadership roles in civil defense. They weren't just involved in domestic preparedness. So let's fast forward to today. And this is the debate that I was talking about. In 2021, the municipality put out a survey to folks to gather their thoughts about what they thought should happen to this site. About 12% of people said nothing, do nothing, sell it. 20% said demolish. Majority, 70% of people, said they wanted to see it turned into something, like a community meeting space or heritage interpretation, even a cafe to trail users. So right now nothing's happening to the bunker. It's sitting there. It's pretty political. I'm often called to come to council meetings to talk about the architectural significance of this site, which is something I never thought I'd ever do. But oddly, this is really a popular topic. I get called to be on like 580 radio and all kinds of things to talk about this bunker. People are fascinated by the bunker. This is a story that was reporting on repair work published by the CBC in 2023, and you can see the comments section reveals the public reactions are mixed. People are saying, like, it's a waste of money, we have lots of homeless people. No, these folks are out of touch with reality. Why should we be preserving this when there's so many other things to do? So let me ask, what does the history of the Cold War bunker and Waterloo region have to do with us today? I'd argue a lot. It's not just a piece of military infrastructure. It's a part of a larger cultural story about preparedness, responsibility, and survival. And these are questions that are still with us. We're again facing threats from nuclear warfare, but also increasingly authoritarian regimes, and the growing impacts of climate change. More and more communities across this country are experiencing displacement for multiple reasons. So how will we prepare as communities for what is to come? The Freeport bunker was built with one thing in mind, right? Continuity of government after a nuclear attack. Today, we imagine different kinds of futures, but the challenge is the same. How do communities prepare? How do we take history and use it to inform action? In our current project, we're working on a digital exhibition to share this story with wider audiences and hope that it becomes more than just a Cold War artifact, that it sparks conversations about community, resilience, and what it means to imagine a shared future in uncertain times. So I'll leave you with that question. What does the history of a Cold War bunker have to do with us today? Perhaps more than we think. So thanks for listening. If you want to get in touch with me, that's my info and all of the people who helped put this project together.
Will you take 3 questions if there are some?
Yeah, if people have questions, I'm happy to,
Your posters, were they trying to get people to donate money to it? I don't.
Yeah, there wasn't a big, like you're thinking of war bonds, right? Yeah. That was sort of more like a First World War, Second World War thing, but there wasn't that. With these posters were people getting involved, community involvement.
Yeah.
And we're trying to raise
the word
money.
support.
Exactly.
Sort of caught,
Mm-hmm. Marcus,
Who
yeah.
was it that actually decided or commissioned the building of the bunker in Waterloo? Was it the municipality or
It was a municipality, yeah. We're trying to figure out why they did that, and we haven't been able to come up with a good answer. We've been combing the council minutes from the 1950s.
Is there just like one really paranoid guy?
I think there was. I think there really was. And the Advertising Council of Canada kept having their meetings in the region of Waterloo, which was back then called Waterloo County. So we think there was a bunch of paranoid guys who pushed this project forward and made it happen. But sadly, yeah, there isn't much of the historical record that'll let us tell with certainty what really the historical narrative was back then. Sadly, I wish there was that smoking gun. Yeah.
Is there a reason they built it beside the Grand River?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it has its own power supply and water supply, so I think that probably had something to do with it. But we didn't find any information out about that location necessarily, and why it was chosen by the county. There is a group of engineering students at the University of Waterloo who approached me this year, and they built a mock-up of what the bunker would look like if it was made into a museum, and it looks really interesting. It looks pretty cool, and they incorporated a lot of Indigenous history into it, of course, because it's on the banks of the Grand River, which has it's an important waterway, part of the Haldeman Tract, the Haldeman Treaty for Mohawk peoples, and so I think there's a lot that could be done with a site like this in terms of our local history, making those connections. Yeah. Well, thanks for listening. I hope I made the Cold War a little bit interesting for you.
That was fascinating. So brings our recent history to life, and our Not so far back, so it was great to hear, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Just want to let everyone know about what's coming up next. Our next lecture next month, on October 16th, is by a friend of mine, Tom Fournier, who's been a military reenactor for about 25 years. And his topic is historical reenacting, why on earth do people do this? And is drawing upon his 20 years of experience as a War of 1812 reenactor. He's going to talk about his motivation and his memories. He's traveled around the globe. He was at a reenactment of the Battle of Waterloo a couple of years ago. And he's met royalty, and he's even experienced the paranormal.
Wow.
So some of his images are just phenomenal. They look like they're out of a movie set, some of the reenactments. So it'll be a really neat talk next month. And also in November, we're actually doing a symposium here, a full-day symposium on remembrance and liberation. We have 6 speakers, lunch is provided, and the bar is open too. So back and Friday. So thanks for coming out tonight. Have a great evening. See you next month.
Thanks, Ken.